Now we are officially recording. So good afternoon, everybody, once again. So we're looking at, I'm trying to, in these two remaining sessions prior to the Yomim Noraim and the Chagim, the high holy days and the festivals that follow, I'm trying to somehow cope with what's going on in the world with what's going on in our tradition, and how if we can kind of integrate the two together. And I'm also, in the process of trying to put together drashot sermons for, the high holiday season, and trying to be a little bit relevant, not too relevant, because in a way I want to somehow let you escape from the day-to-day, but we have to somehow at least be aware that the day-to-day does exist, and we are experiencing the turmoils of the moment in so many different ways. So that, so it is an interesting time. What my opening, I'm going to look at some text with you, but my opening, point will be a controversy that has arisen in the Jewish world. I mean, there are always a few of those. The one that's become especially heated in recent days, I think, is of interest, and that is the Jewish reaction to Black Lives Matter. And there were two pieces that I got hold of this morning that reflected two opposite points of view on that issue. One comes from the Rabbinical Assembly. It's written by our newly appointed executive vice president, Rabbi Jacob Blumenthal, a very good friend of mine who I appointed to leadership when I was president, and he's now risen pretty high. He's also the executive vice president of United Synagogue, really an outstanding young Jewish leader. And we're going to hear a lot more in the years to come. So they have that position, which and then the position that, from a more right-wing perspective, that appeared this morning on what is called JNS, the Jewish News Service, which is a kind of a right-wing counterpart to the JTA, to the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, which is more mainstream. So the JNS piece by Jonathan Tobin basically is very critical of the 600 Jewish organizations that signed a one-page ad in the New York Times last week supporting Black Lives Matter. And that included conservative movement organizations. And everything to the left of the conservative movement did not include very much to the right of the conservative movement. So in a sense, if you want to really oversimplify this, one could say that the Orthodox world and the right-wing political Jewish organizations do not want to give any recognition or approval to Black Lives Matter because of what happened in 2016, when the group that founded the first group, which was known as, it was known as, I can't remember the name of the, I think it's like Black Lives Movement. I just can't find it. A Movement for Black Lives. That's the official movement that began in 2016. And in its initial policy platform, it identified with BDS and Palestinian rights, and was not friendly to Israel. And I remember that was the time when I was still president of the Rabbinical Assembly. I was at a meeting of the leaders of the various movements, and I was in very strong opposition personally to have any identification or relationship with Black Lives Matter because of its very hostile to Israel. But again, that was the initial founding movement, which was, not Black Lives Matter of today, but the movement for Black Lives, from which came what today is known as Black Lives. Interestingly, last week, the same organization issued a revised 2020 Declaration of Principles. No mention whatsoever of Israel, no mention whatsoever of Palestinian rights. So that was dropped. And clearly it was reflective of one of the more radical elements in that group. But that was pushed aside for the sake of of better relations with the Jewish community, who have actually been pretty active in terms of marching and protesting on behalf of Black Lives Matter. So there's been a change of attitude, and now you would not have had 600 organizations 4 years ago signing that ad, but there would have been many. We probably would not have, but there'd be many others would have. But there's still controversy. There's controversy within the Rabbinical Assembly regarding our joining that ad. There were some of our colleagues, a minority of our colleagues, but some of our colleagues were opposed to, even today, our signing it because of the early history of that movement, which was not friendly to Israel. And others will argue today that the whole shift of history has changed, and just as what happened in the NBA last week, where beginning with the Milwaukee team, but followed by virtually the entire league, suspended play for a couple of days in its playoff season in this very unusual year, as a solidarity with the Black community and the outrages that have taken place in terms of policing and the Black community, primarily in the U.S. But I would just add parenthetically, those of us who were part of the racism discussion we had last week in our shul saw how even within the Jewish community, even recently, many of our Jews, our young Jews, have been victimized by racism. So it's not something that is foreign to our world as well. So it remains a controversial issue in terms of how one identifies, and it's really reflecting the heat of the moment. I think one of the most tone-deaf statements in modern Jewish history was uttered last week by Jared Kushner, who went out of his way sometimes to bring great shame to the Jewish people, when he said that reacting to the NBA boycott, he said, well, he's good. These guys make a lot of money, so they can afford to take a night off. Which is, caused, I think, unimaginable embarrassment to the Jewish community. That he's certainly clearly he identifies very strongly as a Jew, as an observant Jew, and that was not the kind of message that one wanted to reflect. It doesn't mean, by the way, there aren't legitimate arguments on the right that would say we have to be cautious here, because I would be the first in line to say that if there were going to be any kind of revival of an anti-Israel element to their program, I would be very far from identifying with it. So, I think that comes first, and that's not negotiable as far as I would go. So I recognize that, lack of identification. I repeat again what I said earlier, that when I was at this table of movement leaders, I was the strongest advocate for not having a relationship with the group because of their beginnings of being really strongly anti-Israel. And I even was to the right of Chabad at that meeting. I was more strident than the Chabad representative was, which was interesting. That was, by the way, some other setting I'll talk about that organization, which was the basically called the Rabbinic Round Table, where you had from Reconstructionists to Chabad and everything in between represented, all seated at the same table. Probably the only existing body in the Jewish world where everybody was together, very friendly, very cordial, but also very forceful in advocating our opinions. But this is something that really has exploded now because of what's going on in the U.S. And it's, of course, exemplified in the political struggle in the U.S. between Democrats and Republicans. Democrats, being strongly supportive of Black Lives Matter, and Republicans being very skeptical and saying that there's no racism in the U.S. and the Democrats saying there is racism. And there's clearly exaggeration on both sides. So I think one could take both sides to task. But nonetheless, it is an issue that is very burning, a very hot issue, and one that has today reached the Jewish media in terms of opposite opinions being expressed as to whether or not we should be identifying. I think that a lot of us hark back with nostalgia to the days when Abram Joshua Heschel marched with Martin Luther King, when there were very, very strong bonds of identification between the then referred to as the Negro community. Of course, that has changed. The language that has clearly changed. It's not a term that we use today. But that was, there were very strong bonds between Jewish leadership in many circles and what then became what today known as the Black community. And we feel good about that. But in the after the '67 war, this tensions rose over Israel, etc., and things there were confrontations in primarily in areas of New York, like in Brooklyn, and you had certain leaders that were, not very friendly to the Jewish community, and a rift developed that was, has not really been healed today very much. But there clearly is a lot of sentiment, by the way, also expressed by many Orthodox leaders today, in terms of wanting to understand and try to reconcile, with the Black community, and recognize the pain that they feel when, they basically, as they will say, you get pulled over when you're driving for the crime of being Black, and that's something that's hard to identify with. And I hope you saw, and if you haven't watched the video of the discussion we had last week at the shul on the issue of racism within the Jewish community, and that was very powerful. We had these young members of our community um, who were people, Jews of color, who had horrific experiences in our community, in our institutions, in our day schools, in our synagogues, not our shul, but but in a sense, didn't mean that even in our shul we're blameless. That the fact is that things that we don't even realize, that these people are told, can you really be Jewish? You're not really Jewish. Who converted? Because how can you be Jewish and Black, etc. People coming from India. Oh, there are no Jews in India. Who says there are Jews in India? It's a teacher telling a young child in school, and it was really very powerful to see that how prevalent, racism can be, and those of us who are part of the mainstream in the Ashkenazi Jewish world, let's say, don't appreciate it because we don't have the same experiences. And Israel too has, there are a lot of issues on that front. As much as we're very gratified and derive tremendous pride in how Israel rescued thousands upon thousands of Ethiopian Jews and brought them to Israel, and it says, it's the first time that there were ever massive transfers of Black individuals from slavery into freedom, and not the other way around. So, we have a lot to be proud of, but it doesn't mean it always works that way. And there's, the issue, Israel confronts that challenge deeply as well. And it's a tough issue, one that we have to reconcile. So that, in a sense, requires us, I think, to be sensitive to the outcry of Black Lives Matter. Of course, never for a second condoning rioting, which I think one is probably equally blamable on the extremes of both sides. There's not only one side that's rioting. You have the extremist groups of both sides, and you have the far right wing groups. You have the Antifa on the far left, and so there's blame to be shared, but that is never acceptable. But clearly, the fact that there is now this outcry, when it's a peaceful outcry, but nonetheless a very strong outcry, it's one that I think has to resonate in our community as well. So I'm going to, before I look at text, I'm looking to see if anyone wants to comment or question. And I apologize to those who are, well, I assume I'm getting some long chats here that I'm not going to be able to read now. See, John sent me along. Did anyone want to say something? Then I will unmute him. You can actually unmute yourselves, but if anyone wants to comment before I go further on.
Can I ask some questions, Rabbi?
Okay, absolutely. Go ahead.
Under Sharia law, is it true that once Muslims attain the land, from their purposes, it's their land forever?
Well, Bernie, I would be remiss if I were to say that I am an expert in Sharia law. It's possible. I'm not really talking about Jews and Muslims right now, and I think we have a lot to say against, the Islamic approach to a Jewish life into Israel, and I would probably agree with you on virtually all of those points. But I can't speak for Sharia law. I know, I know nothing about it, and I don't, I'm not going to take either from Fox News or from CNN, their definition. I think I stay away from things with which I'm not an expert. It's very sad, by the way, in a sense, for the world today, that the ties that existed between Islam and Judaism, like in the time of the Rambam, Maimonides could quote Islamic philosophers, and he felt very at home with them. So there was a time when we had really good relationships. That didn't last, obviously, through history. Largely, but not only because of Zionism, the rise of the state of Israel. But I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of things in Sharia law that would make me sick, frankly. Look, someone could look at the Torah and say, if you have a rebellious child, you stone him to death. Some people could say that may be a little bit harsh. Although on the other side, to answer that, I would say that I don't know if there are too many recorded cases of that having happened, even though there'd be times that parents would have been tempted stone their child. But there are very few, I don't think there are a lot of recorded instances, but nonetheless, we can find in any religious text things that are going to be challenging when viewed from a modern point of view. But I'm the last person that's going to defend Sharia law, but I also don't know a lot about it. So I don't, long answer to your very short question.
Okay, can you distinguish between sovereignty and annexation?
Well, Bernie, with respect, can I ask what this has to do with our discussion? I mean, we're not talking about that today. So
Right.
I wanted, because we're limited in terms of time. I mean, it reminds me of sovereignty. We're both Montrealers. Reminds me of Sovereignty Association that that was spoken in the old days when there were the separatist issue was really hot in the center. That was one of the possibilities. I'm not, I think that situation. I mean, even that's been put on, by the Trump administration. That whole idea of annexation has been kind of put to bed right now because of the priority of trying to establish relationships with other Muslim countries, which I think is the correct approach, because that doesn't necessarily change a lot on the ground. I think that basically what exists now. It would be more, again, I'm not answering your question by answering it, but I think we probably, I think that again, that's a, I would want to hear more from experts, but it may be more of a, I'm not sure in terms of real time what the difference is between the status quo and what that would achieve, but it was not, I think not most everyone viewed it as being not the thing to do right now because of the opportunity we have with the Gulf states and perhaps other Arab nations of establishing peace treaties. And I think that ultimately for the Jewish people of Israel is really the priority of the moment and more important. Eventually that discussion is going to, and until that may take, I don't know, that might be beyond the lifetime of everybody on the Zoom when that will actually happen, when we'll be able to sit down and have real talks with the Palestinians. But again, even though I said we're not talking about this now, I'm talking about it. I want to get back to the more general, the basic issue of our relationship with the rest of the world, and not dealing, outside of the Israel issue per se. I mean that, because that we could go on for days. But I want to just deal with, primarily around here, home, in front of North America, and how we relate to these tensions, how we respond to the outside world. Let me see if there are any other comments, then I'm going to go look at a couple of texts with you. John?
Yes, the sundown clause on sins and hatred. We have in the Torah where the sins of the fathers are visited to the fourth generation, and we have another one where you can't judge a father for the sins of the son. You can't judge the son and the sins of the father. So at what point do you let go of all these sins and hatreds and old wounds? When do you give it up?
Well, I mean, one can argue either side, and you could say you don't let go. But I think, I mean, the best example of dealing with that challenge, excuse me, was the huge fight in the Israeli Knesset between Ben Gurion and Begin, Aleichem Shalom, over accepting reparations from Germany. And that was a really transformative moment in the history of the state of Israel. And ultimately, if you've been to Israel and you've seen all of the Mercedes buses, you know that Israel did accept reparations. That was Ben Gurion's position because Israel needed the money. The time was in the 50s, early 60s. Israel was impoverished and really needed the billions of dollars that were going to come in with reparations, and Begin wouldn't have any of it. He would not rely. He was unforgivable, to the 10th generation, unforgivable. He never made peace with that. And both were very valid positions. I think I understand. Begin, who was a survivor, and endured horrific wartime experiences. Ben Gurion did not have a similar experience. He was already in what was then Palestine. But nonetheless, they came from very different. Ben Gurion was the practical one, and Begin was the ideologue. He said that there's no possibility of forgiveness here, and and that was we still wrestle with that issue today. To what extent do we accept reconciliation with Germany for what happened? I mean, it's going back with 75 years since the end of the war, so it's a long time. But nonetheless, that is still difficult for a lot of people. I mean, I do my electric razor is German, but my car is not. I mean, I never reached the point of getting a German car. Well, other one can make the case that Germany's been very good to Israel and is very, there's no reason not to today. And so there's no, I'm not saying that but I'm just saying we all have to wrestle with that as to at what point do we totally reconcile. When I was in Berlin 3 years ago, it was a very powerful visit, but it was difficult. I mean, I just felt, and even when I've been a few times in the Frankfurt airport, on the way to different places, when I've had to go to Israel and been unable to make the direct flight because of timing issues, and I had to fly through Germany. You still, and you walk out and you see the sign Achtung, you get a feeling in your gut. I mean, it just feels, wow, this is hard. So I think that feeling is not one that's easy to reconcile, no matter how much time passes. Maybe we're sadly approaching the time in the next 20 years when the last of the survivors will no longer be with us, and that's already most survivors today. Child survivors are already approaching in their 80s. Though we're teenagers are in their 90s, and I'm doing a survey, and I'm leaving right after this class to do a service for a survivor of the Shoah who was 97. He's when he passed away yesterday. But you're seeing that will we're reaching the point. The next generation of our kids are going to be in a time when there'll be you'll have memory of people. I once met a survivor of the Shoah, and that's going to be. But I'm saying so we're still, it's hard to imagine where we're going to be a generation from now when it's going to all be memory and no living testimonials, recorded testimonials, of course, and written testimonials, but nothing has the power of a real life testimonial. So at what point is our feeling, will we still have those challenging feelings of hesitation, even though there's all kinds of valid case to be made for recognizing and accepting the warmth and the friendship that we've received from Germany in these last decades. At what point do we say it's we're okay with this? At what point do we still struggle with it? I've quoted in previous sermons, and I may do it again in my final year, but I've quoted the speech that Elie Wiesel gave in the Reichstag, and he read a Yiddish poem in the German parliament, and it was just so incredibly powerful to imagine that moment when the person who exemplified survivors of the Shoah, showing them, you thought that this institution was going to lead to the end of the Jewish people. No, we're still here. The language that those who were murdered spoke is still spoken, and we read poetry in that language. And just the power is incredible. But we're at it's hard to know. At some point, John, I think frankly, it's easier to forgive Black Lives Matter for what was said in 2016, and which was no longer being said now. Okay, that was they were listening to their progressive wing a little too much, but they understood that, there's a bond between Jews and between Blacks. Both can learn from each other. And there have been tough times in Williamsburg and other parts of Brooklyn. There have been confrontations. And there's still anti-Semitism in parts of the Black community, and to tell you a secret, there's still racism in parts of the Jewish community. We have a long way to go, but that's easier, I think, that you don't have to carry over for generations. With Nazi Germany, it's a bit harder. So that's a very, very tough question you asked, John, but a very, very fundamental question in terms of how we navigate the world, and at what point do we put the bad stuff aside and try to build a better tomorrow. Very tough. And of course, I apologize to Bernie because I kind of cut him off, but I think also we find a lot of that, a lot of the tension now, anti-Semitism becomes anti-Zionism, and anyone who says anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism, I think is a fool. I don't believe I think it's a distinction without a difference. But it becomes a more genteel way of denouncing, the Jewish people through the only Jewish state on the planet, and it doesn't mean Israel's beyond criticism. We spend a lot of time criticizing Israel. Every Israeli criticizes Israel. No one agrees on anything. There's plenty. It's okay to disagree. You don't have to. There are it's a democracy, and there's room for various viewpoints, but to undercut the existence of the state, like the on the far left of the of the members of the House in the U.S. of the of Congress. You have at least two, maybe three people that are virulently anti-Israel on the left, and you also have on the far right now coming in someone from QAnon who is also deeply anti-Semitic. So you have on the extremes, you have that very dangerous attitude as far as Israel and the Jewish people is concerned. But I think we're very fortunate now that it's really relegated to the extremes. It's not mainstream, but nonetheless, one can't rest on one's laurels and assume that would never change. So we have to always be on guard. That's why we need organizations that stand up for us, that watch very carefully what's happening and respond very vociferously to any kind of anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism anti-Semitism that's masking as anti-Zionism and so on. Only if there's one more comment, then I'm going to move on to do a little bit of Torah study with you, because I think that's probably what you gathered, of course, right? Okay, so I'm going to screen share for a moment. I want to look at an amazing text from Talmudic tractate Brachot. Just find it here. Yeah, and this is there are many stories. I mean, it'll be a great subject for a mini course. There are many amazing stories told about the wife of Rabbi Meir, whose name was Bruria, and a real great thinker on her own, believed to have been a Talmudic scholar. Like she was just, and she would make very sharp comments. And Rabbi Meir was very, very committed, very, very dependent upon her advice. And she also was one who suffered a great deal in life, and who had suffered a lot of loss. How two very young children died on a Shabbat. There's a famous Agadah about that, and other losses as well. So she knew suffering from her own life experience, but is quoted a lot and an important figure in the ancient Jewish world. So this is a story about Bruria and Rabbi Meir. You see the highlighted portion. So this was okay. So there was you see the introductory comment of Rabbi Steinsaltz, who's setting the context for us, and we mourn the passing of Rabbi Steinsaltz in the last couple of weeks, who was a tremendous force in modern rabbinic history, and who made the Talmud accessible literally to millions of Jews who would have difficulty with the classical Aramaic text, first translating it into Hebrew, and then his commentary being translated into English. And it wasn't simply a translation of the Talmudic text, because that had been done before, but it was also offering explanation, guiding you through the text, so making it accessible to generations that otherwise would not have been able to really enter the world of Talmud and understand what was going on. So, looking at this text from Steinsaltz, with regard to the statement of Rabbi Yehuda, who said that David HaMelech King David did not say Hallelujah until he saw the downfall of the wicked. Okay, I'm not going to go. There's sources that deal with that, but we're going further. So he tells a story about the Talmud tells us that there were biryonei, there were like hooligans, ganavim. They were like lowlifes, let's say, in Rabbi Meir's neighborhood, who caused them a great deal of anguish. Rabbi Meir prayed to God to have mercy on them. That on them, meaning on him, on the Jewish people, on his town, on the other people in the town, not these hooligans, and that they should die. In other words, he wanted basically God have mercy on us, kill all these horrible people, let them all die, And so Rabbi Meir's wife says, Bruria says to him, what is your thinking? And here in the Hebrew, my da'atay. What do you think? What were you thinking? In other words, we say that today. And on what basis do you pray for the death of these hooligans? It's not nice. It's like and do you base yourself on the verse as it is written? Because Berea could quote verses as readily as her husband. Are you focusing on the verse Yitamu Hataim from Psalms? Let sins depart. Let sins disappear. Which you interpret to mean that the world would be better if the wicked were destroyed. But then he says, it doesn't say, it doesn't say chotim, it doesn't say sinners, it says chataim, sins. In other words, and the Christians say, so that's what's being said here too, the Christians say, love the sinner, hate the sin. Here, basically, she's saying almost the same thing. You'd want to destroy the sins, but you want to pray for the sinner that they do tshuva. Very appropriate to this season of Elul, that you want them to improve them, that you want them to stop being sinners. In other words, while there's still hope for them. So you don't pray for them to die, you pray for the sins to vanish, and the ones who are committing the sins to do tshuva. And so you go on, we just continue the text. Go to the end of the verse where it says, and the wicked will be no more. If, as you suggest, transgression shall cease, refers to the demise of the evildoers, how is it possible that the wicked will be no more? That it means that they will no longer be evil. So pray for God. I mean, you can say the wicked will be no more. It could mean two things. It could mean the wicked are all going to drop dead, which would solve the problem pretty quickly, maybe. But maybe what you're saying here is pray for God to have mercy on them, that they should repent, they should do tshuva. They won't be wicked anymore. The wicked will be no more because they're not going to be wicked. They're going to be good guys. They're going to improve. And so then we have the last part at the top of the next page, that Rabbi Meir saw that Berea was right. He listened to his wife. He prayed to God, Avihu, for that God should have mercy on them. And that day, actually, it happened. Hadaru b'tshuva. They did tshuva. Interesting thing in this text, apparently, we're talking about the Jewish Ganavim. I mean, they were. It's not like they were Gentiles. They weren't Goyim. They were Jews, but there were some bad Jews. There were some bad guys out there in the Jewish world. The old story of the first person who goes on a trip to Israel, is taking a tour, and they're driving on the bus, and the guy points out, well, here's a prison. Here's Ramallah prison. And so someone says, but there are prisons in Israel? So, there are, not every Jew is a tzaddik. There are Jews who get in trouble. And the prison, by the way, I think it's kind of not that far from here. It's kind of like in upstate New York, where religious Jews want to go to because they have excellent kosher food. They even have vending machines with kosher food. So that's where Michael Cohen went, even though he's not observant, but he knew that it was a very good place to be because it was, because they really accommodated Jewish prisoners rather well. So there isn't a small number of our people who are, in cheder, as they say. So don't assume that that these biryonim, these hooligans, were Gentile. They clearly were Jewish, because otherwise their doing tshuva wouldn't make any sense. The fact is they do tshuva because, as opposed to Rabbi Meir first is really angry at them. You guys have really messed up the world. You've done terrible things, and it just God, get rid of them. Who needs them? That extreme position is mitigated by Berea, who says, Meir, it's pasnish. You can't ask God to destroy. You want them to, and make it possible for them to stop sinning, not to be destroyed. Give them the second chance, and that's how that beautiful Agadah ends. So that's, in a sense, a paradigm, perhaps, of how we view the world, where we have opportunity not to want to make everybody into our enemy, not to hold on to every bad memory, but to find ways to reconcile and maybe they're going to repent. They're going to move away from a very harsh attitude toward Israel, perhaps. Maybe not. But then we have to be on guard. But nonetheless, there is a way to view those who anger us. We could want them to be totally destroyed, and that's what the extremes do in these confrontations that take place. That's it's bad for everybody. So now I want to look at something else, a very famous Agadah from Tractate Shabbat that it's lengthy, so I'm gonna go through it quickly. It's a classic story of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, who gets into trouble because he refuses to be politically correct, and he's honest. So there's a discussion that takes place where you have Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon. They're all seated together like serious rabbinic figures. And at the table is a guy named Yehuda, who's a convert. It says the son of convert. In other words, that's important because of what will happen later in the story. And Rabbi Yehuda they're talking. They think they're having a confidential discussion. They think nobody is listening, and outside of the rabbinic community. And Rabbi Yehuda starts saying one nice things about the Romans. These Romans are pretty good. Like the beautiful markets. They build the shvakim. They have markets. They have gesharim. They built bridges. Great construction. They're great architects. Merchatzot, wonderful bathhouses. They've done good stuff. Rabbi Yossi doesn't say anything. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai then says, "Are you nuts? Everything they've established, it's for their own purposes. Don't think they want to do it for us or for the world. It's for them. Marketplaces so they can have prostitution, bathhouses so they can pamper themselves, bridges to collect taxes from all who pass over them. So don't assume that they're doing it for us or for the good of the world. They're doing it to enrich themselves. And so to hell with them." And so Yehuda, the son of converts, goes visits his mishpacha. They're not, and in their family circle, because they're converts, they have relatives that are not Jewish. So they have Roman connections in their own families, and he starts telling the story about this discussion. So it eventually gets back to the monarchy, to the government, to the leadership, and they basically impose death sentences on these rabbis. And so Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and his son, Rabbi Elazar, they have to go into hiding because there's now a death sentence on them because his anti-Roman comment was reported back to them. It's like this happens so much in the world today. It happens frequently in the Arab world, I have to say, and in some other countries that are oppressed, like in the former Soviet Union, that are in the news right now. If you criticize the government, you can then spend your life in prison, and those news stories are in the media every day. So that was the case in the Roman period, that Jews were under Roman authority, and if a Jewish leader would criticize Rome, they were in big trouble. It was a capital crime. So he goes to hide, very famous story, and you have the first, the first level of hiding is that he hides in the Beis Medrash in the study hall. His wife, Rabbi Shimon's wife, would bring them water and bread every day so they could eat. But then the decree intensifies. In other words, they're really looking. They send the A-team to go search out these criminals, and so they have to really go into hiding. They hide into a cave. They spend 12 years in this cave. There's the miracle of a carob tree that springs up and feeds them. But they, the whole day, you can read they have to sit. They remove their clothing during the day so the clothing doesn't get soiled, and they're in sand up to their necks so they can study Torah, because otherwise they can't study in the nude. So bodies have to be covered, so they're in sand all day, and then they study Torah. Then at night they could get dressed, they can daven, and then So it's a crazy story, very, very great suffering, and then finally the emperor dies, and so the decree is nullified. So they're allowed to be freed. And that's really where the story begins, the part that interests us. Because if you look down here, so when they're freed, and all of a sudden, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, they see everybody, they go out and they see everybody is, the way it's in the original text in Hebrew, Manichin chaye olam umoskin b'chaye sha'a. They're busy plowing and taking care of the fields. They're abandoning the eternal world. In other words, they're not studying Torah. They're busy. They're plowing and they're sowing the field, and they're not into Torah. They're into the day-to-day intricacies of life, but they were abandoning Torah study. So they were so angry. Wherever they would look, they would burn. They would destroy whatever they were looking at. Wherever Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Elazar directed their eyes, that site was immediately burned. And then God says to them, Yatzda Badkal, a voice comes from heaven and says, you came out of the cave to destroy my world. Go back to your cave. Go back to the cave. They go back for another year, and then they kind of do tshuva, for that year of realizing that they couldn't come out to destroy, even though they were really angry at what was going on. They felt that they had basically sacrificed themselves for the sake of Torah, and people were not taking Torah seriously. They come out and see that. They're very discouraged. They say they're destructive. They're sent back to the cave. And then it's interesting because the story is really beautiful. After the year comes, they return and they see that life is going on as it is. And so Rabbi Elazar, the son, was still angry, and he would still look at people and his eyes would just be destructive. But Rabbi Shimon would heal those who were harmed by his son's eyes. So and then eventually just to the story will end with they're outside of the cave, and then finally they see people observing Shabbos. They see people observing Shabbos, and they finally feel there are still Jews who take their Jewishness seriously. There's still Torah study. There's still Jews who love the mitzvot. So then I feel better, and they're no longer angry at the world. But it's a great classic story, because it suggests that the world will often not live up to our standards, and that's part of something we've wrestled with for thousands of years as Jews. How do we respond to that? Do we hate the world, or do we try to find reconciliation points and points where we can meet with the world and not and maybe have a positive influence on the world? I think that's something that we I would just juxtapose an Elie Wiesel and a Jared Kushner in terms of how you relate to the world. Do you relate to the world with disparaging comments? Do you relate to the world with comments that reflect humanity and that bring people closer together? So I think that's something that we need to keep in mind, and that we have to kind of follow the ultimate example of Rabbi Shimon and not his son. The son is still the angry young man, but the father, at some point says, what, we gotta, we can't take out our anger. The world will continue to disappoint us, but at some point we have to find that thread of reconciliation where we can have connection, even though it's going to be imperfect, even though we'll still have points of dispute, even though there'll still be challenges. Nonetheless, there still needs to be that point of contention, that point of connection, where we recognize that our mission is not to destroy the world or to destroy all those who aggravate us. At some point, we need to find a way of bridging a gap. And that doesn't mean, by the way, just before I break for questions, that doesn't mean, by the way, that we put ourselves at risk or that we subject ourselves to harm, because I think nobody of sound mind or body is going to be able to articulate a position that we surrender ourselves, that we put ourselves at physical risk in order to be nice to everybody and not and be beyond any criticism. We'd much rather be criticized and be alive than not criticized and fall victim to oppression. So and that was part of I think that's the correct response to taking us back to Israel that we've had, when people have thrown, why Israel, Jews used to be such nice boys, why are you all of a sudden bombing Gaza? And the answer is we're bombing Gaza because you're sending flaming balloons which cause destruction. You're setting fire to our country. That we're not going to tolerate. We'll be nice when you're going to be nice. We'll be happy to open the entranceways to Gaza and allow humanitarian supplies and even allow humans to go back and forth. When you stop setting fires in our country, when you stop performing acts of terror, until then, we're going to be as tough as nails. And I think that's a position that is really hard to argue, because self-preservation does come first. But it does mean that when there's an opportunity, when in a time of quiet, for there to be some reconciliation, we want to make that possible. But nonetheless, that tshuva on the other side has to still take place. So okay, I'm gonna stop, and I'm gonna just look for comments or questions. You don't have to agree with me. Anybody? Okay, Doreen, are you adjusting your camera, or you're raising a hand? So you're allowed to unmute yourself. So if somebody wants to just signify, Barbara, was that you or no? Did you see? Nobody? I mean, you're also quiet. Nobody wants to say anything. Let's see if I'm looking. Look at page 2. I think you don't have. Okay. You don't just listen to me. You don't want to say anything. It's bad enough that on the high holidays you can't respond to me, but now you can. You say, I can say whatever I want, and you're stuck. You can just yell at your computer screen if you're watching a live stream. But I'm just going to see if there's anything in the chat.
We have an affinity to the Black people. We were slaves. They were slaves. And when it comes to Moses and King David, their wives weren't of the local tribe there. They're
I'll take it one step further. That, and I said this on Wednesday night when we had the seminar. I said that undoubtedly Moshe Rabbeinu was a person of color. He didn't grow up in Norway or in Switzerland or in California. And these are people coming from Middle Eastern countries, which tended to have darker skin. So, unlikely, our patriarchs also, we don't have, there are no photographs, unfortunately. We can't find any photographs that were taken. But undoubtedly, a lot of our forebears were people of color. I mean, that was part of the world from where we came. They weren't like, they didn't grow up in Hawaii or in California or in Toronto. I mean, they grew up, they came from countries where, that was the majority of people were people of color. So we'd probably be very shocked if we were to see. I know there's a whole controversy in the church when somebody wrote an article, assuming, positing that undoubtedly Jesus was Black. And he had all of these evangelicals going mashig because all of these icons and all of these statues and all these pictures, they'd have to be, oh my God, I can't envision that. But that's very possible, very likely. That wasn't, we have these assumptions that are not necessarily correct assumptions that our forebears, were likely there, we don't really know, because again, there's no photographic, and it wasn't something that was necessarily described, but they're different, literally they're different shades of Black, they're all color. You can go from light to dark. I mean, you have Kamala Harris, Black versus other people who are, who don't have, she's mixed race, as it were, with significant Jewish elements in her life. Interesting. But there are, we don't really know. So, but it really, ultimately the color should be irrelevant. Ultimately the color should be irrelevant. And that we have to get to that point. And, we want to encourage as much as we can our kids to marry people who are Jewish, who either are born Jewish or become Jewish through choice. But it shouldn't be, whatever color they are, Gesundheit, that should not be an issue. And I think one of the good things in the newer generations is that that's becoming less of an issue. I wish Jewishness were more of an issue, but it's something that one needs to and it's a big leap, because we've had such a history of that divide that has really that has affected how we behave to each other and how we look at each other, and what our vision, what our dream scenario is when our kids march, stand under the chuppah, what they should look like. And
Rabbi,
mm-hmm.
I would just also say that Ruth was a convert, and she was from Moab and had dark skin.
Right.
And for anybody who might have missed the program on Wednesday night, it's called Our Prayer for Canada, Anti-Racism in Judaism, and it's available to watch on this week's newsletter from the shul.
Okay, Linda, thank you. And I would go further than that. Not only was Ruth a convert, she became the paradigm of convert. She is the model convert, because the words that she says in the book of Ruth are the most stirring words of identification with the Jewish people that have ever been written, ever been spoken. Your people are my people. Your God is my God. Where you live, I will live. Where you die, I will. In other words, it is a full, total identification in very, very stirring, powerful language that resonates. And Ruth becomes the model of the convert. As a matter of fact, my predecessor of blessed memory, Rabbi Pappenheim, used to insist that every woman he converted had to take on the name of Ruth, whether it be a first name in Hebrew or a middle name. I haven't followed that necessarily, but his practice was that you can be Miriam Ruth or Esther Ruth or whatever. There'd be at least Ruth had to be part of your name to identify with the first convert to our people that history recognizes, who's Ruth. So it's not simply that she was a convert, but she was the convert of converts, and as you say, undoubtedly, a person of color, and which is good, which is great. But that's we have a long road to travel, and life becomes increasingly complicated in a very complicated world, exacerbated by people in this time of pandemic having extra time on their hands and too much anger leading the way, and not enough serious talking and listening to build for a better world. So it's just really there's so many. I mean, it's very hard to find respite from from all of these the tensions from the political warfare taking place primarily south of us, much more mild in Canada. I always wanted to complain that I don't think Canada needs better scandals. We're really very schwach when it comes to scandals. That, like this WE scandal, I can't get into it. In other words, it still strikes me as, who cares? The previous sponsor, other scandals come up. There aren't, you need a good, they're juicier down south, and certainly in Israel, scandals are really pretty good. There was a cynic in Israel who would always refer to what is Parshat HaShavua. We refer to Parshat HaShavua as the weekly Torah reading, right? The weekly Parsha. But Parsha in modern Hebrew is also the word for a scandal. If you how do you say scandal in modern Hebrew? It's Parsha. Like it means it literally means an episode. So Parshat HaShavua, but didn't mean the weekly Torah reading. It was the scandal of the week. So they say, my Parsha, what's the Parshat HaShavua? There'll always be one. So, we have to learn, and we have to do better with scandals, because they're not very riveting. I mean, I can't read about Canadian scandals without falling asleep after the third sentence.
Rabbi,
yeah.
My granddaughter from Hawaii, she's listening to the scandals in Canada, and she agrees with you. She says, you don't know what a scandal is.
I know, they're schwach.
I'll show you what scandals are. And she can't get over the as you say, the we thing and a few other things that Trudeau has been doing. She said, this is nothing. This is nothing. Come to the States. So she agrees.
Look,
we didn't have any scandals. Never mind.
Yeah, well, I guess that's a good thing about Canada. I mean, even though I'm not taking a position in defense or in opposition to the Liberal government or the Conservative, I'm staying out of those politics because I have no, I have no horse in that race per se. But I'm not saying that he didn't make mistakes or didn't do things that were wrong. But I'm just saying that we have to they're very boring scandals. I mean, they really need something. Like we had the sponsorship scandal in the time of Chrétien, which also was and it was a scandal. I think during the Harper administration, where a cabinet minister had a $16 glass of orange juice in a hotel in London, and that became a major news story for 5 months. And orange juice can be expensive in hotels in London. Everything's expensive, and water would be $12. So I'm saying, but that was something that engaged our media for a while. I mean, we'd done better than that. Come on, like a $25 glass of orange juice, I could then I can understand. But 16, whatever. But I'm saying that maybe it's probably one of the advantages of Canada, because sometimes it's good to be boring. It's good to not have that level. Look what's going on down south in Michigan. It's quite. I mean, it's just totally nuts.
A real scandal, Rabbi.
Pardon?
A real scandal to think about is the rabbi in New Jersey who wanted to avoid a scandal of divorcing his wife, So he hired a hitman to kill her, and then the rabbi wound up in jail.
Yeah, that was interesting. Yeah, that was definitely that's not the recommend. They don't teach you that in rabbinical school. It's not a good way to deal with the breakup of a marriage. It's really not a that's highly not recommended. But in terms of like it does. But political scandals are just it's the nature of. I think I remember, and I don't remember the details. I just remember from my childhood the name Gerda Munsinger in Canada, one of our major ministers was caught up in a prostitution scandal or something. That was a little bit more, that was a bit better. In other words, a little more enticing than, even though I don't remember, I wasn't that politically engaged in my young years. But they were, that's already, you're on the right track. When you're talking about the price of orange juice or,
Rabbi,
mm-hmm.
What bothers me is the mixed feelings I have when I hear about the anti-Semitism in Brooklyn. And like, how do we take that to one side and still have sympathy on this side when there's still a lot of anti-Semitism among the Blacks? Sure, some of them are friendly, but some of them are racist against the Jews, and it's troubling.
I have to be honest there and say that here I would say that I think it is troubling for sure. But I think it's a case of taking two to tango, because I don't think all of the Jews who are living in Brooklyn are lovers of, I think you have racism on both sides, for sure. There's a lot of room for, it's not as bad as it was, going with 20 years when there were like, when the Lubavitcher Rebbe's motorcade, hit and killed a young Black child, and there were race riots, for weeks. And Sharpton was involved in that. They were protesting at Jewish stores and Jewish businesses, some of which were destroyed. It's, we've gotten much beyond that in terms of there are better relations, but it's far from perfect, for sure. But so I think there's, but it's not, the anti-Semitism is not the only thing we have to finger. We also have to finger racist attitudes within the Jewish community. And in that Jewish community, they're very prevalent, to be very honest. Like in the, I have to say that I subscribe to I get a daily email from something that's called Borough Park 24. It's like a news network that gives you news from Borough Park. So it's basically coming from the Haredi community. It's a Hasidic community, not just Haredi. It's from a Hasidic community of Borough Park, giving you the news. So every second item is like a traffic accident, a weather report, or this taking place or that taking place. But every item in between is a simcha, like is a yurtzeit commemoration for the grandson of a certain Rebbe, a bris taking place, and they have like hundreds of pictures of the celebrants at these events, and they're all Hasidic Jews from various Hasidic dynasties. And I look at these pictures, and there are hundreds of people together. They're taken now, like this week, not a single mask, no social distancing, and I'm just trying to find a way of responding and say, look, there aren't enough Haredim that have died. Give me God, what? This is not normal. You don't have, and you see rooms packed with people like on top of each other, hundreds of people gathered together for these celebrating a yurtzeit of a Rebbe or something. And it drives me crazy. And the fact is not that I'm saying this has nothing to do with racism, but the idea that, there needs to be a certain sensitivity to the times in which we're living. And that's a community that obviously is ignoring any of that reality, to their detriment, because there've been hundreds, if not thousands, of deaths in that community. And there've been a lot of, there've been, they give you the reports of the various rebbeim who've died, and they give you all the memorial tributes to all of these rabbis and in those communities, most of the men are rabbis. That's just part of the education. They all get smicha in their education. So there'd be thousands of rabbis in that community. There's a different one, every day there's just a lot of deaths taking place. I'm a member of a rabbinic body of 1,800 rabbis. As far as I know, none of our rabbis have died of COVID. We have people who've died of old age, but no COVID, because basically, in the community, we're sensitive we're wearing masks, we're distancing, we're not opening shuls prematurely. We're being very cautious, as are most of the modern Orthodox community to a large extent. But you're seeing in some communities that reject the world, that say that whatever goes on there is of no interest to us. And we can then, we don't have to worry about it. and they're suffering as a result. And of course, other people suffer as well, because if they're going to get the disease, they're going to afflict other people as well. On that very uplifting and positive note, I do have to run. I realize, let's look at the time, and I have to run to a funeral. I have to put on a tie and get to the cemetery. So unfortunately, I have to leave you for, this happy moment of studying together. And we have one more session next week, same time, same station, to conclude this little unit on Midrash and Agadah and the outside world and how we bring the two together. Okay, Toda Rabba, all of you, thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you very much.
Rabbi.
Thank you guys, be well.
Thank you so
be
much,
safe.
everybody. Take care.